Hello, everyone. We're back. It's another Friday. What a Friday it has been. I saw a man about a car. It was a whole thing. Elliot, you're here. We're very happy to have you. I hope you're doing well. Hope things are
No, I
good.
wandered in. Well, I was wandering hither and thither, so
You
to speak.
you wandered in, and that's fine. As long as you find your way home. So we'll
Well, I'm
we'll
not very stormy though, so it's okay. I'm just wandering, not storming.
yeah. That is a good segue as any, I guess, into what we're talking about today. We're gonna be looking at a short little text. This was a newspaper, well, it was like a journal and article um, that Carl Jung, famous Swiss psychologist, wrote back in 1936, called, well, I guess in English, Wotan, or you would say Woden, probably. In German, it's Wotan, and Wotan in German, Woden in Old English are just the different versions of the god Odin. So different versions of the theonym, to use a fancy term. Yeah, this is, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the journal article itself, but this is more of a jumping off point and perhaps a very awkward introduction into an idea that me and Elliot have been kind of kicking around over the past few months. People who've been watching the show, thank you to our small yet loyal viewers, have been hear us sort of work puzzle our way through, which is, um, you know, objective reality or objective spiritual reality aside, are there more than one God? In some ways, the to kind of catch people up or to remind people, this really starts with Elliot and me discussing the that one, I think it was episode 11 of the Daily Wired Exodus series, where it actually wasn't JP, it was very based Jonathan Pajot from French Canada, talking about perhaps there are more than one God. Perhaps more than one God exists, maybe not sort of above all worlds, but within the world. Maybe there are many sort of spirits, right? And they can interact with you transpersonally, and that you can either choose to, you could participate in them or resist them, or that you can invite them in or reject them. So yeah, this seemed kind of like the natural next thing to discuss. Um, Carl Jung, I will say, first off, I am not a Jung expert in any way, shape, or form. So I will probably make mistakes in representing Jung's psychology here and his philosophy, but so apologies for that ahead of time. But ultimately, I'm not here today, neither of us are here really to represent Jung. You can read Jung, and lots of people who are far more knowledgeable in Jung, such as Jordan Peterson, can fill you in far better than we ever could. We're using Jung as a jumping off point. We're using Jung as kind of like a thought germ or something like that to spark the imagination and take us to a place we maybe wouldn't be able to get to. Um, so the name of the journal article is Wotan in German, Woden, Odin. And it's kind of all about, this is written in 1936 from a Swiss person. So Jung is writing in German here. I read the original German because why wouldn't I? Elliot looked through the English because why wouldn't he? It's okay. It's fine. Translations are good. That's why they exist. Um, Jung is writing as a Swiss person looking to the north, to Germany, to see what's going on and sort of trying to psychoanalyze, at least is how I read this, what is happening in Germany. And what by that we mean, as people have said in other places, mid-century Germans. Why are the Germans Naziing this way? What could be driving Germans to do these things that seem, in a very typical Swiss fashion, Jung is basically saying, apps so bizarre and so over the top. Swiss, I don't know, Elliot, if you've ever been to Switzerland, but the Swiss are very regimented, in some ways, kind of like the Germans, but also way more less extra. Kind of like,
So I would say it like this: the Swiss being a mountain people, or you could have n letter n dashes
yeah,
is instead of commas. Being a mountain peoples find themselves necessarily separated from the rest of the world, and the Germans, being a plains people, find themselves thrown into the world, pun
well said.
intended.
Well said. Well said. Yeah. So it's interesting because although this, I mean, me cracking into the original was fun. It's written in German. It's not a German perspective. Believe it or not, kids, there are other countries and other peoples in the world who speak German who are not German. It's a Swiss perspective, and it's a decidedly Swiss perspective, which is kind of cool.
He even calls out the Swiss, by the way, which I thought was pretty refreshing.
Yeah, no, I mean, Jung is doing he's being chaotic in his own way. I mean, he's slicing all directions, I think, with this. Um, he's, looking at I mean, the title of the article is Wotan. So Odin, the old English version is Woden. By the way, this is where we get Wednesday, Woden's Day, as in Mr. Wednesday from American Gods. Read the book, maybe don't watch the show. The show has gotten, season 3 is rough. Season 2 was rough. Read the book. Ian McShane is great as Mr. Wednesday. I will say that. Great casting. The problem is the writing. Regardless, Odin is probably how most people know this god now, probably mostly because of, the extreme popularity of things like Thor, the Thor comics, Thor movies, but then also sort of the Viking craze of the past roughly 10 years or so, which I have, as somebody who studies Viking things, I have somewhat mixed opinions about the pop culture explosion. I don't know if it's helped the field any, but Odin, right? So when you hear Wotan here, when Carl Jung talks about Wotan, fill in the blanks with, Odin. Odin was a very fascinating, still is a very fascinating mythological figure. Talk about chaotic neutral. Odin, man, a god of passion, in all senses, of just unbridled hedonism on one hand, but on the other hand, a helper, right? A wanderer and a helper to those who perhaps need his help. If this sounds, if the wandering aspect and the helping aspect of Odin sound familiar to some people, and if it sounds a bit like Gandalf, that's not an accident. Tolkien took kind of a lot of the good aspects of Odin and wrapped them up in the character of Gandalf. And by the way, Gandalf is one of Odin's many names in Old Norse, so that's kind of cool. Obviously, Tolkien's doing his own mythological project, and is essentially like purposely Christianizing myth. And whenever
But he's also sort of saving Odin in a certain
saving
way.
Odin, yeah, he's taking the good parts of Odin. He's baptizing Odin, you can say, in the character of Gandalf.
Literally,
Yeah,
right?
well,
Because
it's
he could
interesting
have
because
chosen pure
he's
wanderiness.
well, he splits Odin into two characters,
Right,
Gandalf and Saruman. And we've talked
right.
about Saruman before. So Saruman embodies all of the negative qualities of
I see.
Odin: conniving, crafty. That's what Siaru in Old English means. Saru, Siaru, crafty man. But whereas Gandalf has sort of the wandering gray pilgrim, he's known to intervene when it's least expected, right? He helps you, turns the tide of a battle. So Odin is this fascinating mythological figure. Odin kind of becomes the god of war. And depending on which pop culture universe is drawing from which version of Odin from the original myths, you tend to see different sides of him. Sometimes he's a helper, sometimes he's super conniving, sometimes, and it's probably the more accurate depiction, he's kind of both, because that is what kind of, when you read through Norse mythology and the various sagas where Odin appears, he's sort of both. He's a helper and also kind of on his own mission, and also might kill you, and also might sleep with your wife and give birth to some sort of demigod figure. He's doing all these things, and that's why Jung points this out in the article. Odin, he really is kind of a god of passion, of unbridled passion. We don't mean passion in the Christian sense of like passion on the cross. We mean like in the older sense of like, I am ruled by drives. I am ruled by drives, and I go where my drives drive me.
Being visited by muses is another great way, I think, of putting it.
Yeah. Odin is sort of a god of excess, He becomes a god of war. Wasn't probably originally a god of war, although that's a minefield in Old Norse studies because I have my own opinions about that, which I will gladly share here. Note that some people who are very, very smart and wonderful people, I think even Jackson Crawford, who is a great, great guy, love Jackson Crawford. He would probably disagree with this here. So if we have some crossover with his channel, this is just my take. Um, Odin doesn't originally seem to have been the total war god, and I may be perhaps Crawford has no disagreement with me on this. It does seem that Odin is kind of a usurper, and that's pretty well reflected in the mythology. Odin takes the mantle, the title of All Father. Probably wasn't the original head honcho god. In
Well, did Odin have a wife? Canonically,
Well, there's different versions. Well,
Mhm.
this is the problem. So this is the problem with doing any of this kind of stuff is you have the version of Odin as reflected in things like the Poetic and Prose Edda, which are the records, right? That's what we have. And so you can kind of give the canonical version of everything, right? But then there's this big caveat, this big, huge, it's not even a pinch of salt, it's a pound of salt. That, these are later records coming out of a Christianized era. And so it's difficult. It's difficult with Odin. You're left with things like you can make kind of etymological arguments about Odin. I'm more I'm more open to etymological arguments. I know a lot of people who in Old Norse studies are not, and that's fine, right? Like I think they have really good things to say regardless. I'm not trying to add anybody here. Odin, Tyr prob I'm of the camp that Tyr was probably, if not the main god, he was in a much higher level in the pantheon. Odin probably is a usurper. And that happens as we've talked about when we've been discussing like Baal and Asherah and other various Canaanite deities, that you would have sort of competition, right, between various cults, between various sects. We like our god, you like your god, whose god is going to win out? Tyr, the name Tyr, just means it's one of the many words for deity, for God, supernatural, big dude in the sky or beyond the worlds, right? Tyr sort of becomes the god of like justice and of like correct action and following through on things. And this is also why Tyr gets his hand chomped, right? Tyr gets his hand chomped off because he's gonna do the thing and he puts his hand in Fenrir's mouth and it's spoiler, ends up losing a hand. Fun fact, we have a dog. I love my dog. And I clean my dog's teeth every night because I am that anal of a dog parent. Fine. You can call that cringe. I don't care. I love my dog. I want her to have a happy mouth, right? She's a dog. I love her. And so I have to clean my dog's mouth. My dog does not like her teeth brushed. And so every night I have to put my hand inside my large pit bull's mouth, and she's very gentle. She's very gentle. But I do like to joke with my wife, Tyr is putting his hand in Fenrir's mouth, because every night I'm like, here we go. Are you gonna follow the rules, dog? So the Tyr story is fascinating. We could get into Tyr another day, but Tyr, there's indications that Tyr was the main god. Odin usurped that place. And regardless if that's true or not, I think it follows based on everything we know about Odin, right? Everything that his established character traits. He kind of just takes what's his, takes what he wants, and kind of doesn't give a shit about what anyone thinks. Does it cause problems for others? Totally. Does it cause problems for Odin? 100%. Can he change? Nope. He's living his best life, right? He's being the chaotic dude. The chaotic. I would argue that Odin is very chaotic neutral, does what he wants, takes what he wants. It could be good. Like, it's not always bad. Like, I, for one, like to think that giants are probably not great, right? Giants are not probably great. And maybe you want a conniving allfather who's going to maybe like keep the giants at bay, right? Perhaps. But the way he goes about doing it, right, obviously is completely, let's say, of a very different sort of moral grounding. Anyhow, Odin. Why am I talking so much about Odin? Because Jung's basic argument here is that Odin or as he would say in German, Wotan, has resurfaced, right? Odin never went away. Jung's argument here is that Christ never really truly defeated Odin in the minds of the Germans. And again, Jung's making sort of a quasi-nationalist argument here that the Swiss are very different from the Germans, and that's a whole other can of worms. But Jung's basic argument is that Odin it was a sleeping god, much like Cthulhu, right? Odin was just asleep, like King Arthur, also kind of just asleep. You have these sleeping mythological characters, right? Odin was asleep and he has awoken. He's out and he's doing things. And in Jung's sort of defense of this idea, he points to the north, because again, he's writing from a Swiss perspective, and he's like, look at everything that's happening. And what Jung is saying is not that Hitler equals Odin. That's a ridiculous argument, which he's not making, and he's very clear about that. His point is that Odin, Wotan, is operating transpersonally across Germans and is driving them towards one goal, which is, the first time I read this, I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? And that was like several years ago, right? I just heard about this crazy Jung Odin article. I was like, I'm going to read that, right? I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. But in the past 4 or 5 years, there's, let's say, been some things that have happened. Elliott, you probably paid attention,
right,
where people were driven towards things that kind of, they didn't even know why they were doing them. And you're like, well, why are you doing this? Why do you support this? Safety. Whoa, okay. Or democracy. Weird concepts that nobody can really define, and yet everyone's driving and doing crazy things. I mean, cutting people out of their life, saying that people should be excluded from society, all this crazy stuff for nebulous concepts. And so over the past 4 years, some shit's happened. My perspective has totally changed on some things, so it's very interesting coming back to this text. I thought I knew it. I was rereading it and I was like, oh wait, I think I don't want to say I get it, right? Because I'm not a Jung expert, but I think I kind of understand the things that Jung is talking about, how there are sort of, what Jung would talk about, archetypes that sort of live in the minds of people, and maybe they sleep in the minds of people. And if you get enough people together, maybe the right kinds of people, the right kinds of conditions, the archetypes can come out. So Jung's argument is,
I would call them like unexpressed memes, if you're familiar with the idea of an unexpressed gene that could potentially flip on, and how there are epigenetic phenomena that, basically the way in which you live your life or what has happened.
It's epimemetic phenomena.
Yes, 100% epimemetic is exactly what I'm saying. And by the way, there would be some who would point to Lawrence or to Krauss as Woden, but I don't think that's true. I actually think that Trump is a much more Odin figure in this. I think he fits much more neatly into that.
It's the greatest. Here's the thing. We're gonna get the giants to build Asgard. They're gonna build the wall, and they're gonna build it at a fraction of the cost. We got our man Loki on the inside. Wonderful guy. I've talked to him many times. And this is the thing. The Giants are going to.
I just got off the phone with Loki. He's joined the Giants.
Yeah,
that wall just got 10 feet higher.
Yeah. This betrayal will not go unanswered. Send Truth Social. Yeah.
You know what? I just looked down at Hale. Wonderful place, wonderful people there. But Loki, he's at the forefront. He's leading the Giants, and the other very bad people who are going to try to destroy us in Ragnarok, but it's okay. We know Loki's end. It doesn't go well for him. How's that bowl coming? Are you making that bowl right now?
It's very sad for Loki. I once heard he fucked a horse. By the way, that happens in Norse mythology. So yeah, once heard he had sex with a horse. The horse's name was Sleipnir or Pussy. I don't really know, but it was yes. Anyhow, Trump's has an Odinic quality to him for sure, because Odin's also a trickster character, right? As much as people like to say, well, Loki's the trickster, I'm like, yeah, Loki's like the chaotic bisexual trickster for sure in many respects. But Odin is also, by the way, kind of doing some stuff that Odin engages in Sather magic, which you're not supposed to do if you're a dude, and so he's also kind of gender bendy, and he likes extravagance, and so Trump's got an Odinic quality to him. I can buy that, but you know, before we get so locked into the X equals Y kind of thing,
Oh, of course, of course,
that's
of
not what
course, of course.
it's not what
And
Jung is arguing
and
here. Right? Jung is saying
and
that
by the
Odin
way,
is working across. It's not like Hitler equals Odin. It's that Odin is sort of alive and thriving because the Germans, whether or not they believe it, although as he quite rightly points out, there were actually a minority, but a very diehard minority of Odin worshippers involved in the Third Reich. It's fascinating shit.
yeah, and Third Reich occultism is
It's
frankly completely bizarre, even for
so
occult
weird.
circles.
By the way, we should
Like,
say, because of YouTube, it's evil. We don't like it. Everyone knows
yeah,
it.
yeah.
But it is bizarre, and it's fascinating in its bizarre quality. There was the we've talked a little bit where Elliott is the expert, has talked a little bit about theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, and all this stuff a little bit on the show. We're going to get into that more in the upcoming weeks as we talk about the Ghostbusters people. It's going to be very cool. But there was this weird, bizarre Arianosophy. I don't know if you've heard of that, Elliot, where they're like,
No,
it's theosophy, but for white people.
yeah, I haven't looked into that. Like, that's a sort of realm that, because I haven't heard about it. Thank God, right?
It's really
Uh,
cringe. It's really
you
cringe.
you got to be, obviously this is going to come up when you study anything. So you could, the way in which this would come up is if you're studying like you are doing with the history of Germany and stuff like that. That's where that would come up. Like, if you're chilling with like normal theosophists, like, unless you were really driving in that direction and you're asking like, so yeah, tell me the history of the cringe elements, it's just not going to come up, because theosophy was sort of one
Well,
of the first, one of the first transracial
yeah,
Western based
the
ideologies, I would say.
the Arianosophists didn't like the theosophists because they were too
Yes,
inclusive. Big shock.
correct.
Yeah,
Well, right, and
yeah.
they still are quite inclusive in a lot of ways, although it ends up being kind of a white man's game, because it's the solution to a white man's problem, honestly, right? To a certain respect, and that makes more sense if you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, point being is that, to your point though, Colin, um, just to draw the lineage real quick, is that there's Blavatsky. She was wildly influential. Obviously, Nietzsche was aware of this, right? This is probably
And Jung,
why.
sorry to interrupt, but Jung quotes extensively from Nietzsche in this article because he's using Nietzsche as an example of an unintentional or subconsciously Odinist person. Right.
Correct, right, and in a completely different direction, right?
Right.
And Nietzsche's daughter, or like one of his, like his cousin or some female chick, was the reason, basically, why Nietzsche got so tied with the Nazis, because she was a Nazi herself and said, "Oh, all my relatives' work, is totally is in line with that philosophy, blah blah blah." So that's why historically he gets so heavily tied to that regime, because one of his family members sort of took him and ran, and this was well after the point where he was really able to defend himself from this sort of attack. The classic Nietzsche photo that everybody knows about, where he honestly kind of looks like he is disheveled a little bit. It was her kind of propping him up, frankly, and it's a bit disgusting, if I'm being honest. But anyway, not the point. Point is that none of these people are should be seen, that we're bringing up, should be seen as like instances necessarily of Odin. However, as Jung points out in this particular piece, there are possessor gods, and then there are gods who sort of take possession, right? And I think that's a good potential setup. I'll go ahead and spike the ball to you, Colin, because I know that you're really excited to introduce this. There's two different types of gods, right, that are sort of taking the worship, and there's other ones that are sort of actively possessing people throughout the ages, and that possession may or may not be evil, right? We think
Right.
about possession as unilaterally evil, but the thing is
if
that
you're
if you're being
Christian,
possessed by
I'm of the
angels,
opinion
it's not a problem.
I think probably more of the Eastern Orthodox would be more on board with this statement. I've met some Catholics who are on board with it. A lot of Protestants really go bells and whistles crazy. They don't like it, but I mean, spirit possession, Pentecost is coming up. Spirit possession. So,
In theory, all
right, the
Christians are
spirit of the
possessed
Lord,
by the Spirit of
yes,
Christ,
they're
period.
possessed
And
by
if
the
you're
Spirit of
not, then you
Christ.
fucked up, right? Like,
A lot of Protestants go wee wee wah wah about that because they think of like heads spinning around and green vomit. But that's a demonic possession, kids. Which is a
oh,
perversion of
notice
what,
that we had to
right.
clarify the type of possession there.
No, but you do have to because
Right? Like,
right, yeah, you have to. But I mean, this is well attested in also in Judaism, right? Like the Spirit of the Lord could come upon people, right? And I mean, for Pete's sake, like if something is inspired, right? Like this is an inspired work. We still use that today, maybe in more like, mundane sense of like, oh, it's an inspired performance by, I don't know, Timothée Chalamet or something like that. I don't know. It's positively inspired. Like somebody in the New Yorker will say that. That comes right. That's a dilution of the original meaning of the word, which is like it's possessed. You're being, the idea was that like various, in a pre-Christian period, various gods, essences of an art, muses, whatever, would possess you, and then you would be able to do beautiful things, right? Or
and
horrific
and
things,
and
depending on who
frequently
was possessing you.
people, every epic poet would invoke, right, specifically a muse, right? They'd be like, hey, muse of poetry, please help me out here. I'm trying to write an epic poem over here.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, so spirit possession, I mean, my point is, you don't have to be Pentecostals rolling down the hall, the aisles, right? You don't have to be a holy roller to get that. It's like I always like to say to anyone who will listen, at least speaking to to the fellow frozen chosen who get all pearl clutchy, us weird Protestants, it's like, by the way, you're all possessed by the Spirit of Christ. Get over it. And baptism was an exorcism. Get over it. It's what
And
it
is
is.
an exorcism, by the way.
It's actually an exorcism. And every Easter, when you reaffirm your baptism, you renounce. It's the same baptismal renunciation. If it's just, you're just saying it again to remind yourself. So this is actually like most, I guess the point we're trying to make here, at least the point I'm trying to make here, and I think we're on more or less on the same page, Elliot, is that like every culture throughout the history of humanity up until like the modern period has recognized that possession is real, in the sense of possessed by a spirit or spirits of something. And I think the point, to bring it back to what we've talked about in a few, some episodes ago, during the Daily Wire Exodus episode, where Prager got all up in arms about this, right? And Pajot was like, but let's be honest, right? I think Pajot was definitely won that argument. He made a much better point.
100%. 100%.
Like, you are possessed of things all the time, right? Are they good or are they bad is the question, right? Is it a beneficial possession? Is it a negative possession? High emotions can change the way you act, right? We talk about crimes of passion. Passion, everyone. That maybe it's not an excuse, maybe, right? But it's different, right? Cold-blooded versus, cold-blooded murder versus crime of passion, right? Even in the legal system, we, at least, theoretically, there's a distinction between these two things, right? Right, like a bar fight is a lot different than mugging someone. They're both bad, right? They're both violent. But a bar fight, he said this one thing, this other guy said this other thing, they got in each other's face and there was a fight. Okay, that's a little different, right? Than just like, I calculate the time to strike and I attack somebody who's not looking. Totally different. Even in a legal sense, we recognize that there is a difference between these things. And maybe it's because in some, again, objective spiritual reality completely aside, let's set that aside for a moment. Just think about on a psychological level, right? Assuming you can make such a distinction. But I'm talking to I'm trying to bring in the cringe new atheists, like get away from the crazy new atheism and think about it. You can be possessed of emotion, right? Strong emotion can make you act, and does make you act, in ways that you would never act normally. I mean, I've had experiences in my life both good and bad, where strong emotion allowed me to do things I wouldn't normally have done. And I have negative examples of that. I think a lot of people in a highly sort of masculine phobic society don't like men having strong emotions about anything. And so that tends to have like, oh, you're violent. But there's been times too where I like just got angry and took care of things that needed to be taken care of. And
and
people were happier for it because I got pissed. So
the issue, yeah, there's quite a few
point is that this
things.
is normal, right? Like
Right.
regardless of whether there's spirits jumping between people or not, functionally, we'll cycle back to that later. Functionally, is there a difference? As it presents itself in the world, is there a difference?
And what's the functional solution, right? Is the functional solution a dry, rational argument? At this point, what's been very useful about the last 5 to 10 years, as certainly after like Gamergate, say, the new atheists have finally recognized that rationality is almost totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
Um,
And people like Jonathan Haidt have essentially kind of, he makes a good case for it, have kind of proven that like nobody's really rational.
and
Not
obviously
really.
everybody knew this. It was only a kind of weird blip in the kind of sort of the crowning achievement of the 20th century to finally wind that argument all the way. And I think that a lot of new atheists have now realized, okay, the animal spirits do at least functionally exist,
Yeah.
right? And so it's time for us to start really contending at that mythological level.
Yeah.
And that's what somebody like, say, James Lindsay has started to do. That's what Jordan Peterson certainly started to do. Of course, I think Peterson like probably knew this for a longer time, but like, you know,
Well, but
he's now
Peterson, if you listen to any I like Jordan Peterson. I know
no, I do too.
it
I
might
do
come
too.
across to the show on the show that I rag on him a bit, only because he's just, we're all a product of our generation, and it's just I have a thing about boomers sometimes. I love them, but they drive me nuts.
Well, he's a lefty Canadian boomer, which
Yeah,
is a different type
it's a
of,
different kind of thing.
yeah.
But Peterson also has had some very, I think they're genuinely meaningful experiences with First Nations Canadians. From what
Right.
he's done a whole thing about the insane abuse stuff that happened at residential schools. I mean, it's, by the way, I don't normally do trigger warning. I wouldn't recommend listening to those episodes unless you're really ready for it, because it's rough. It's not like, it's not, they're good episodes, but interviewing people, it's whoa. I made a mistake of listening to that on a day where I was already sad. That was not a great decision. So make sure you're in a good place before you listen to that. But it's important to listen to. And and obviously there's a lot of darkness there, but Peterson strikes me as somebody who's genuinely interested in how he has this perception of being very pro-Western, because he is, but he's also very open to other cultural viewpoints of dealing with trauma and things like that. Obviously, he's a psychologist, and he's somebody I think who has had some very meaningful and beneficial relationships that he's built with First Nations Canadians, and I think he just sort of, also being a Jungian, kind of gets the importance of like a connection to nature, right? And that nature can have a spirit or multiple spirits, and that they can mean something for somebody, and they can mean something for a culture, and that they can be a way to kind of put things back together in a certain way. So I think that there's that too. Yeah, sorry, that was just, keep going.
No. Well, actually, I think this is a perfect time to maybe do a tiny bit of what
I mean,
Jung
I also
means
say
to
this
me.
because you're from Alaska, and there's a fair, Alaska has a higher, well, Alaska doesn't really have people, but there's a higher population, right, of Alaska natives, right? So that's more of a thing in Alaska than it is in a lot of other states. So that's only
Well,
that's my
right.
little, yeah, yeah.
You're right. And I don't, the funny thing is I don't really need to listen to that episode because yeah, I know all the details, right?
Right.
Like
The
um
details. It's rough. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm like, yeah. It's rough on all sides, by the way, right? Obviously there's a European side to the roughness, but then there's also I just listened to somebody on a different podcast. I think you gave this podcast to me, which was that one with the funky boat going over the edge of the thingy thing, whatever. That has been a very good podcast.
You have to be more
Anyway,
specific. I sent you so many things.
well, no, hold on, I'll look it up real quick. But
Okay,
point
yeah.
being is basically like I totally get where that's coming from, because again, it's you know, in the Alaska context, just like the Canadian context, it's a far north situation, and essentially a lot of there. I'll say it like this: there's more than one disease that came over from Europeans, right? And one disease that came over was alcohol, right? Now, I'm not saying alcohol is a disease. What I'm saying is, like, when it hits your society and you've literally never had it for like multi generations,
Yeah.
it can really wreck your shit, especially when it's concurrent with the complete demolishment, literal decimation on every front of that word, right? Of your culture, that just does not allow for synthesis of new ideas. So you're already stressed, and then you add on disease and alcohol. It's like not going to be a good time. And then,
No
of course,
bueno.
a huge technocracy,
Yeah.
imperialist technocracy that is looking to grind everybody to a paste. And then, of course, World War II fucks everything up, right? In terms of like everybody, obviously the Japanese take center stage in terms of the internment camps, but there is definite native internment camps too,
Oh yeah.
right? So, it gets pretty bad. So it's interesting, right? Because on the West Coast, we feel a lot more in our bones that sort of European side of World War II, that European experience, much more than the East Coast guys do, I think, because I'm maybe they had internment camps over there, but we certainly had them over here, and
Yeah,
that kind
it
of
was
is
more of a West Coast
living
thing.
memory.
There,
It's a living memory type of thing.
yeah, there's a living. I mean, you can go to places too, like near Seattle, Bainbridge Island had a
Mm-hmm.
really thriving American Japanese, but really American community of people who were, had maybe parents were from Japan, and that's all gone. And that's all gone, and that's not just random. That
No,
was
it's very intentional.
FDR. That was FDR just
Well, and
removing.
you can see the intentional capital P progressive and then later descendants of woke
Right.
ideology, right?
Yep.
Really intentionally trying to atomize.
Yep.
Again, Lindsay talks about the ironclad law of woke projection, right? And it's true that they um, the wokes will say and the progressives will say, oh, libertarians and right wingers are trying to atomize people as they are actively atomizing everyone, right? So just
Right.
to be clear, right? And that isn't to say that right wingers or libertarians are pro collectivism, right? As an ideology, it's just that we're realistic in saying, hey, there are natural hierarchies in nature, namely the family and the tribe, right? The family of families, if you will. And these things help to stabilize cultures and societies. And we saw, like, I mean, it's like in the documents where the strategy was to defamiliarize, right?
In the literal
Defamily
sense,
these,
unfamily to
right?
unfamily something. Yeah, yeah.
Correct, right? Like, yeah, it's so that's kind of that like actual history there. But Jung is really interesting, right? Right, because he is one of these figures who doesn't really spawn a school of thought per se. So I would say Jung sits at this funky pivot point, inflection point, if you will, um, between what I would say is like the old world view of what psychology would turn out to be, and the new world view. Because Jung is a bit parallel to Freud. Like Freud was kind of the first guy to kick it off as a field of study, and I think Jung was part of actually an older tradition, um, sort of emerging into the new hyper post enlightenment world, where obviously there's a lot of bean counting and categorization, right? But he sort of makes explicit what was a lot of times properly occult knowledge. And he kind of injected it into the mainstream. So I learned
Yep.
about Jung first through Alan Watts, who is also
Oh,
a popularizer, yeah, of and he talks about Jung a lot and very deeply. And Alan Watts is one of these guys who's talking to psychologists, in my mind, the good psychologists who are sort of psychology, especially in the 50s and 60s, I think was the last vestige of a program from what I could see, which was to try to synthesize industrialization and shamanism together, right? So I would say that Jung is like the Enlightenment era shaman, right? Not in the Blavatsky woo way, but in sort of this middle point between science and woo, and between the old world and the new world, right?
Well said. Middle point between
where,
science and woo.
Right. That's where Jung happens. So all scientists will read him and be like, what the fuck is this guy even saying? Because I haven't studied enough occult stuff to really get all the depth that he's saying, either occult or mythology, a little bit of both, right? Simultaneously, the woo people might be a bit confused about why he is saying the things in this certain way, but it's because he is, if not explicitly thinking himself to be a scientist, certainly a kind of full member of the science as it was at that time, before it got like massively not mathematized, but quantized, right? In terms of like a financial quant or quanta, right? Quantum, right? Like, basically the quantum revolution forced science, I think, at a very deep level, to become more arithmetic based and less geometric based. Whereas before this time, math had been far more of a geometric pursuit with some arithmetic on the side as needed. In fact, the word clever was never, we hear clever and we think, oh, this person's really smart and sharp. But clever was seen as sort of a, I looked this up anyway, and it was seen in the 17 and 1800s as much more of a duller version of being smart, right? It was like, oh yeah, you're doing sort of mental parlor tricks, right? Like they would have said a calculator, that is to say somebody who's good at arithmetic is clever, but they wouldn't have said that they're a genius, right? We in our current era actually have a less good understanding of intelligence, in my opinion, because we frequently confuse ability to calculate, right? And bean counting and accounting with true intelligence, right?
Yes,
you see what 100%. I mean? Like we've actually regressed in our understanding of these things. And so just if you do read this, when he is saying clever, he's not really thinking what you're thinking, which is, oh, that really smart math guy. It's sort of in the negative sense, actually, a little bit of like a smart person who's a big brain, but not really seeing the big picture, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Jung also, quite in a wonderful quote, if I may, this is becoming it's becoming a live reading channel, but that's okay. Can I read a quote? Is that okay?
Go ahead. Well, no, it's a quote. See, we have never read a thing from start to finish, so it doesn't count.
We should just do that in the style of one of our favorite / not favorite podcasters, and just like shill for money the whole time in Patreon. So.
Oh my goodness! Actually, that'd be so boring for both of us, though, because we have to interrupt
we would
every
just give
other.
up and just start talking and like, let's have.
Well, that's the issue, right? Yeah. Like neither of us are able to interrupt. Despite the fact we interrupt each other, we're not able to interrupt and then herder like stupid reference, right?
Yeah.
Like anyway.
Yeah.
like,
so I'm gonna read this in German and English, if that's okay, just because the quote in German is so great. If that's okay. I'll follow up with the translation.
Well, the audience has no say, so fuck the audience.
Yeah, fuck. No, we love you guys. But you spend 15 years doing a language, you might as well use it for something cool, right? So that's what I say. Okay, so this is from Wotan by Jung. Deutschland ist ein geistiges Katastrophenland, wo gewisse Naturtatsachen immer nur einen Scheinfrieden mit der Weltherrscherin Vernunft eingehen. Okay, great quote in German. The English, this is the translation, but it's so much better in the German. Germany is a land of spiritual catastrophes where nature never makes more than a pretense of peace with world-ruling reason. And I think...
Okay, actually, could you reread the German again, now that we have the English in our heads?
Yeah. Deutschland ist ein geistiges Katastrophenland, wo gewisse Naturtatsachen immer nur einen Scheinfrieden mit der Weltherrscherin Vernunft eingehen.
I mean, you could basically pick out the words. Like the cognates are in fact cognates there. I'll just say it like that.
I will say Deutschland ist ein geistiges Katastrophenland. Germany is a land of spiritual catastrophes. It's such a wonderful quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's so true.
it's very true, and you know, is that all one word in German?
Which one? Katastrophenland?
Uh,
Yeah, a land
yeah,
of catastrophe
yeah,
land is what it
right,
means.
catastrophe land, like
Yeah,
literally, like, and of course, you know, there's not this like, oh, well, Native Americans had 120 one words for snow, but like, because that's fake in the same way that, yeah, German also has 120 words for snow, but that's just how like fucking word
yeah,
synthesis works. You know
yeah,
what I mean? Like, come
yeah.
on, guys, it's dumb, right? But in this German case, like, it does, like, it is nice to be able to sit with like, oh no, it's not two words modifying each other in a certain way. You get to have this beautiful blended word of like
That's why I say the
catastrophe.
German is so beautiful. It's so beautiful. It's so well written.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
again,
As,
don't let
as
the
somebody
fact
who
that
like
that
very
it's
mildly
written
knows German.
right, and don't let the fact that it's written in German confuse you. This is a Swiss perspective. This is not German. This is Swiss. Yeah, like
Well,
this.
and
Yeah,
and
keep going.
I
Yeah,
think it's accurate. I think it's accurate though, and to address the quote directly, right? Because this gets back to why I say Germans should not be allowed to do philosophy, right?
amen.
Because they are a spiritualische Katastrophenland, right? Like,
Geistiges Katastrophenland. Yeah,
geistiges Katastrophenland. You are banned from philosophy, right?
yeah, genau.
Until you get your theology, right?
Yeah,
Your
I think
theology.
as we were talking about last night, I think Germans should be allowed to do theology. I think they should be allowed to do music. Um, cars, great. Buses, trains, you know,
Engineering, yeah, all that good
engineering,
stuff.
science,
But
medical science.
until they get their
But
spiritual
just
self fitted out, until they have figured out how to enthrone Tyr over Odin, they're just not ready for it.
perhaps, perhaps, yeah, they just no more German philosophy, please. Uh,
Please, y'all
please.
are fucking it all up.
You
Looking
know,
at
this
you,
is my
like,
stance. The
you could be like,
Swiss,
oh no, that was 20th century, like fucking Klaus Schwab, dude. Klaus
no,
Schwab, fucking,
Adorno,
yeah,
fucking
Adorno,
Adorno.
fucking
Yeah,
Marcuse,
Marcuse. Yeah,
Marcuse,
fucking hell. Like
hmm,
it's
hmm,
yeah.
hmm. The Frankfurt School, like fucking,
The
it goes
fucking
on.
Frankfurt School. Yeah, exactly.
They maintain this shitty that just needs to stop.
Well, and
Like,
as you know, we hope to have him on the show soon. Marshall, as Marshall would say, Marshall talks a lot about Nyarlathotep, and I've basically determined that Hegel probably was an avatar of Nyarlathotep.
an avatar, not just influenced.
Yeah, no, he is an avatar. Like he was a incarnation of Nyarlathotep, and so and it's all gone downhill from there. So yeah,
Um,
but
so
The
the
Swiss can do it.
other sort
We'll
of,
allow the Swiss. I actually
they know their kindred.
I will allow the Austrians as well. But
Oh sure.
there's something about Germans and philosophy, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it is the
Uh,
Hegel. Maybe it is the water. I don't know. There's something, and it's cool to see somebody in 1936 point this
mm-hmm,
out.
mm-hmm.
Something's really off here. Anyhow,
But the other sort of thing about Jung that's because again, he is not fully magical. He's not like an Aleister Crowley in a neutral
no,
sense, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
even neutrally, he's not an Aleister Crowley. He's not a Freud, right? He is literally the middle pillar of the two, right? And so from a tarot perspective, right? I kind of, when I see Woden and I hear him described by Jung, it's very easy to make this very tiny leap in my mind of saying, oh, it looks like Odin is a cross between in the major arcana, right? He is the 9, the hermit, right, which is a wandering hermit with a little lantern and a star in the middle. So he is a hermit, which actually totally fits in because again, that star is a 6-pointed star, like very importantly, right? And actually, in European tarot tradition, it's totally possible that this wandering hermit was perhaps an explicitly Jewish person, but also he's wearing the gray robes, right? The hooded robes of Wotan, right? So freaking straight up Odin, I think, is one instance of, because I think Jung would say that all of these different gods are in some ways sort of downstream of the much larger egregores of these of the potentially he would say this anyway,
Yeah.
of these sort of tarot style, like the nine, the wanderer, and then also there's another card that was coming to mind too, and I will cut in with it at some point. But
That's
yeah,
fine. Yeah.
look at consider the hermit for the nine of the major arcana, and I think you'll kind of get what I'm saying there.
Yeah, no, and that's something that I need to read up on. That you are the tarot person here. Um, Again, at the risk of becoming a live reading show, there's another great quote that I think kind of also will take us on to the next point, or that will help us sort of it will provide us an Übergang. There's some more German, a transition, if you will. If I may. Okay, so this is a little bit later. And this, I don't need to, well, why not read it in German? It's probably okay to read it in German, right? I don't know. Fuck it. I'll just read it in English. People don't come here for German. This is a point. This is on Elliot, for your purposes. This is on 189 in the
Mm,
English translation. All human control comes to an end when the individual is caught in a mass movement. Then the archetypes begin to function. And again, for Jung here, archetypes, fill in the blanks, spirits, right? Gods, something like that. Then the archetypes begin to function, as happens also in the lives of individuals when they are confronted with situations that cannot be dealt with in any of the familiar ways. So with this, I mean, this is very on the nose. Like, everything that the Germans were doing before is not working anymore, right? Like the post World War I Germany can't do things the same way, and so this awakens something within, and all of a sudden, maybe not all of a sudden, but it probably felt a bit like that, right? He says here, it's not just that he doesn't say all individual control comes to an end. He says all human control.
right,
Um,
right.
and I'm just glancing at the German here. And that's actually, yeah, it's in the German as well. Menschliche Regulierung. So that's a good translation there. Again, sorry, I read it in the original. I'm having to catch up here in the English, but yeah, no, like, he's not saying individual control goes away. He's saying human control, which implies that there's something else at work here, which is almost like these archetypes. Maybe they are not supernatural, paranormal. Maybe they are just parts of the human, but they're so much a part of the human, right, that they're not even human anymore. There's something much deeper, and they're taking control. Humans are no longer in control. Something else is taking
Right.
control. And I mean,
It
we're talking about spirit possession. What is that if not a functional definition, at least psychologically? I have to say this, like, JP, what is that if not a functional psychological definition of spirit possession? I mean, what is? That's pretty on the nose.
Well, and notice it's very, and I kind of get a notion of like emergent phenomena more generally, but specifically think about how magnets work, right? Magnets literally work, right? Even permanent magnets, because at every level of resolution, the magnetic fields are all aligned in the same direction, which then defines the North and South Pole, right? And so this is sort of saying humans have lost control, right? So every level of the human cybernetic ability has gone. So both the individual, familial, governmental, and you get a mass movement. Once you have gotten this mass movement through sort of a phase space type of thing for my physics people, these archetypes start to appear, and it's sort of like this. Think about it in two different ways, right? So think about like Mean Girls, how there are those archetypal groups, right? And our protagonist, which is a not quite yet destroyed Lindsay Lohan,
Right.
comes in, and she is a total outsider. She is an uncarved block, so to speak, into this whole thing, right? And she is introduced to the archetypes, right? And the archetypes only exist because they are grouped together, right? So what does a nerd mean? Well, if you had a nerd who was fully synthesized into a different group, right? Like their primary persona right, is a part of the other group, right? So think about like the smartest jock. That guy's going to be a quarterback at that point, right? Because the smartest jock is that guy calling the shots, the team captain. Now, if the jock was
By the way,
also
Elliot, I have to correct you. Offensive linemen tend to be the smartest, but we'll for purposes of metaphor, we'll let it slide. So keep going.
nope, fair enough, fair enough. That's legit. That's legit. Of course, I don't know football
From
that well,
personal
so there you go.
experience,
But
as
no,
an
naturally. So
offensive lineman. So continue.
but actually, okay. So, but even it was regardless. Okay, we won't.
Regardless,
That's very
sorry, I
fascinating.
had to.
No. It's good. It's good because actually the metaphor could continue. But regardless, then you take that offensive lineman and say they sneak off in the in the sneaky times, right? And they go hang out with the nerds. All of a sudden, they're a completely different person within the nerd group.
Oh,
but
yeah.
all of that nerdy energy creates a different grouping, right? So it's sort of the hierarchy changes, but also the sort of there's a sense in which a nerd nowadays, right, if you transported them back in time to a 1950s nerds, would be feel at home. Same thing with all sports people.
Yeah.
How is it that there is this intertemporal character between the jocks and the nerds? And I just use these two for extreme examples because they're really clear. It's also really clear how there's nerdy jocks and jockey nerds, right? Like, just to be very clear. But like, this
I was a nerdy
archetype,
jock. I think I was a nerdy jock. Nerdy jock was probably
right.
what it was. Yeah.
Right. So all of these archetypes, right, only start to exist when you have a critical mass of the people who would make up that archetype, and they all start going in one direction, and all of a sudden you get Thoth emerging out of this nerd, right? Or you get like Loki emerging out of the nerds, right? Or you get Thor emerging out of the jocks, or whatever
Thor's
the
totally
case
a jock.
may be.
Yeah, 100%.
Right. Yeah. A good-hearted jock too, and you could also have some nefarious dudes, but regardless,
Odin is spawned out of the bad boys, the bikes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So these sort of spiritual entities, so to speak, and I say spiritual, maybe astral entities would be another way, or really, honestly, it gets all the way up to ethical and supernal, if you know what those things mean, right? These entities really do start emerging once you have these groups of humans that are not so personally self-controlled, right, that they are kind of forming themselves into the group, right? Like a really great way of thinking about it actually is all of those 1980s toy selling sort of Power Ranger type shows where all the people come together. They all have their own tiny mech suit, but then they literally fit together into a bigger mech suit. That's all we're talking about. Yeah. That bigger mech suit is the deity in this case, the shining one, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, well said. As somebody who loved Power Rangers as a kid, who didn't, and had those toys.
Of course,
everyone had them. They're great toys. Back when they really made toys. Yeah, they're a lot of fun. No, that's a wonderful metaphor. That's a wonderful metaphor. Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if you noticed, Elliot, in the English translation, I'm looking at it here. There's words that there's a few words that they kind of can't translate. They just throw it in German.
I was super annoyed about that, but yes, of course.
I don't, and I kind of feel for the translator. Translation's hard, man. It's difficult.
I get it. Especially into German. There's a lot of funky shit. So.
Especially every language. Yeah. So there's this term Ergriffenheit and various derivations on it. So ergreifen is the verb. There's ergreife. So ergriffen is like to seize or to be seized, to seize something.
And this is what I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, and then there's
the same thing,
right? And even in the English, they use these German words. So ergreife is the person, place, or thing doing the seizing. In this case, it would be Wotan, Odin. And then there's this broad kind of category term, Ergriffenheit, which I would translate something as like on a quick dirty translation of it would be something like to the state of being possessed, probably in this context, by someone or something. To be the state or condition of being seized by something, not in it like seize up. I didn't oil myself. I just stopped moving. It's not like that. It's like something is seizing you.
To be grabbed. Although honestly, a siege like that is probably the same thing.
Right. Well, I mean that's what Odin is doing. Wotan is doing, right? He's seizing. an entire nation in this case, and really in a way through ripple effects, an entire world. Right, like
Mhm.
spoiler, spoiler. Um, and that's interesting. It's interesting also that like they just didn't choose to translate it, but it's also that a Griffenheit is this quality or condition of being seized by something. And it's not even a like tempting, hey, don't you want to kind of come over do this thing? It's like a no in German, that I mean that means like grabbing and holding and
Yeah,
like you are
think
now in
think
my
more
like
about like Legion in the Bible, right?
yeah.
Like, I'm maybe he did some hanky panky, maybe he just pissed off a local sorcerer and they fucking seized him. Who knows,
We
right?
don't know.
Like,
But it's interesting because this Griffenheit, this quality of being seized, is connected to what Jung calls der nationale Gott, or the national God, or as he says here, the nationalist God. That's one of the translations, but the national God is maybe the better translation, the God of the nation. And the God of the nation does not need not be a God that is regularly recognized by an established religion. Right?
well,
You could, it
and
could be
more
its own
importantly,
kind of
it
God.
could be the god of nationalism, right? Or potentially, and this is where,
Well,
you know,
and this is
well,
sorry, if I may,
go ahead.
if I may, we need to get him on the show. It's okay. It didn't work this week. We will get him on the show. As a good friend Marshall would say, I mean, this is Demos, and Demos is a jealous god. Demos is a hungry god. The national god, I would argue that that maybe the national god of Germany at this time was really Odin. I think Jung makes a pretty strong argument for that. And so it got me thinking. I wrote in the margin, I do my own marginalia. I'm a medievalist. We do marginalia. I was like, der nationale Gott in den USA, Demos, right? I write notes to myself in German when I'm reading in German, but I was like, in the United States, who is our national God? It's something like Demos right now, the God of democracy, right? Which is kind of like the God of consumption and churning and like the masses, the mass power, and we just get enough, and it's literally might makes right through just sheer numbers, the God of sheer numbers, something like that. Um, maybe that's just me, and I think Marshall would agree with that, but I don't know, Elliot. I feel like you might agree with that too. Like Demos seems to be something like the national god that's gripping America right now. Who is seizing us? Who is gripping us? Demos? Moloch? Are they the same thing? I don't know. Hard to
Well,
say, you know.
and there's a there's a and so where like, so there could be, say, a father god of the nation, a father god, not the father god, a father god of nationalism, right? Of which there are spin-off brother and sister, or daughter and son gods of each particular nation. Those gods could be the straight up child, the straight up children of nationalism. But and then what, right? And then what? Well, in many different cases, actually, there's lots of different gods by which this potentially it would need to usually be a male female pair to kind of make everything work, right? So in this case, it would probably be a feminine god, right, who is maybe pairing up with Thoth, right? And all of a sudden we have technocracy, right? Right, the
Techne, the god
child,
Techne.
techne, right?
Techne,
Exactly, right? It's
yeah,
yeah, it could be demos and techne, or
yeah.
demosia, or whatever, and that creates the technocracy, right? Same thing with, and of course one could go through this exercise. It's entertaining, one should. So
Yeah, no, it is. It's just it's fascinating because so many people are talking. This is totally not Elliot and me, our own unique idea. I mean, it's our own unique take on this, but so many people are talking about this, at least in our general ideological sphere, or roughly around there, right? You get people like Pajot talking about transpersonal entities and things like that. He has his own very Eastern Orthodox take on it, which I find fascinating. I don't really know much. I still don't. It's so hard to understand Eastern Orthodoxy. I just kind of listen to it and go, okay. I experience it. I try not to understand too rationally because it's a different way of doing theology. Um,
Well, as an Alaskan, right, I can kind of actually sort of appreciate
Oh, you're
Eastern
very Russian.
Orthodoxy.
You're very Russian.
Well, it's well in multiple different directions, right? Because I think Orthodoxy fits extreme environments better in a
Yeah,
lot of ways,
probably
right? Firstly, secondly, and
desert
there's two
or
reasons for
taiga.
that. 100%. And the reason why I say that is multiple, but just think about it like what is the medium is the message in a certain way, right? And the nature around us is the fundamental medium that we're stuck with. And if you're isolated, right, an orthodoxy is kind of the only way, right? Whereas if you're having to be constantly checking in with Mother Church all the time, right, it's much harder for the Catholics to even get there, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
In one sense. Then the other sense is that in almost a totally opposite direction of kind of proving this point is that Alaska, in being part of the United States nation, is certainly American in temperament. It's not Canadian. Very different than Canadians in a lot of ways, but very the same as Canadians. It is the only Arctic America, firstly. So it's
True.
unique in that sense, right? And then secondly, it is separated or sacred, in my opinion, from America, right?
Well
And so
said.
there's this sense in which Americans or where Alaskans see themselves as Americans, but it's one of those states where you see yourself as Alaskan first, right?
Well,
And then
like,
secondly,
yeah.
oh, and then secondly, there's a sense in which like America influences, but is not really the center stage. It's kind of over there, right? And so in that sense, Orthodoxy is I think similar, right? From a Western perspective, right? Which is sort of fundamentally centralizing based off of Catholicism, right? And
Yeah.
Protestantism started to decentralize a little bit, but Orthodoxy has always been in some ways decentralized, right?
Totally.
So there's a sense in which like the intuition is there. If you're from an extremophile place, a place on the extremity, right? I think the Orthodox mentality just kind of makes sense, in my mind anyway.
No, I mean it's interesting. I learn a lot about Alaska from talking to you, and I hear Elliot. You know what I've heard? I've
Hmm.
heard some things. I've heard you can see Russia from your front porch.
Yeah, well, actually, that was Tina Fey's line. That was SNL slander. Not that I like Sarah Palin, by the way, because she's
Still
fucking
funny.
cringe.
It's still
But it's hilarious. It's hilarious. And
funny.
actually, there is a part of Alaska that you can see from Russia
It's still funny.
uh,
Yeah.
on a good day. But
Well, you
yes,
brought
indeed.
up two Tina Fey references in one thing, right? You get Mean Girls as well. So maybe I don't know, we're the logos is guiding us in strange places today. One thing too, and maybe this is a good sort of not that this has to be the final point, but this is perhaps my final point. Um, you know, there's a lot of later in the latter part of the article, Jung talks a lot about this term, about God or gods and stuff like that. He uses this term Gott in German, God in English. And it's interesting because all nouns are capitalized in German, so you just have this term Gott popping around, and it could be referring to the to Yahweh, the or to just Wotan or Dionysus or whoever, right? Like, and it's interesting because in the English translation, the translators, again, translation's a difficult job, is having to make a decision: do I capitalize or God or not? Because just a
Mhm,
different orthography system, a different spelling system in English, and there's a religious connotation in English when you capitalize the G in God, right? And it's
mhm,
interesting that in the original that doesn't exist. It's it's all through context, and it's pretty clear. But that little bit of ambiguity in the German got me thinking about the term God as a term. And it's interesting because people say, "Don't you believe in God?" or "Do you believe in God?" And I mean, a Hindu would probably say yes, but probably in a very different way from a Jew, probably in a very different who would in a probably different way from a Christian, definitely from a different way than a Christian, who would definitely have a different understanding than a neo-pagan, would definitely have a different understanding than fill in than a Muslim, who would definitely have a different understanding than, right? So it's this thing like, do you believe in God? It's like, well, God is it's a category, right? And for better or for worse, in Christianity, right? This is in the New Testament as well, right? Like the Greek term theos, right? Which just kind of means God, like a God, is used for God in the Christian sense. Well, and in the Jewish sense as well, right? That's interesting. I don't fault them for doing that, but it also kind of muddies the water just a little bit, right? Because obviously it's clear what Jews and Christians in Greek are doing. They're elevating the concept of God to God, right? That's a monotheistic religions. But in and of itself, God is just kind of a category, right? So the question always comes down to kind of, and this is a little bit of Carlyle too, right? Like, who is your God? What's your religion? Who is your God? That's what matters. Do you have God or not? In our increasingly cringe new atheist age, maybe that's a more and more important question, but it's kind of like you kind of can't help but have a God. So what is your God, right? To say I believe in God, to me, I'm always like, okay, and what do you mean by that? Maybe that's just the religious studies scholar in me. I'm like, okay, and what do you mean by that, right? Because you can have discussions with, you can have fascinating, fruitful discussions with people of various religious backgrounds, and they'll talk about God, and you realize, as somebody who's, if you're of one tradition, you realize, okay, they're using this term, right? And it means something different than I mean, right? Because
And this is where
God
the
is kind of a concept, but it's not an identity, or it's not an identity or persona, right? And this is making me, I had this realization in the shower, as I tend to do, that okay, that makes sense why there in Judaism there's a prohibition on uttering the tetragrammaton, the true name of God, even though I've already done it, but I'm Christian. You're not allowed to say that aloud, except in certain very narrow situations, at least in the old school, ancient Israelite version of the religion, because that's actually God's actual identity, right? Because God is a term. And this also makes sense too, to tie it all back around, and I will cede the floor shortly, Elliott, but this is the point, to what we've talked about previously this sort of spring. How you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and in Genesis 1 it's Elohim, right? In Genesis 2 it's Yahweh all of a sudden. That's interesting. We've talked a lot about that. But Elohim is sort of I know that this isn't a translation from the Hebrew, but this is an interpretation of the Hebrew, right? Oh, Elohim is a concept. We're talking about conceptually God is creating the world, right? But that's a very out there concept. That's like, somebody saying, well, I believe in God. And I also, lots of people can say that and have very, very different interpretations of what they mean by that. But in Genesis 2, you have Yahweh, who is the personal God of humans, right? Who's creating humans to be in his image. And that's a very different thing. And I do think that ties back into this, where I think Jung is playing in the German with the ambiguity with the term Gott, because again, it's always going to be capitalized in German because it's a noun. And so it's like, well, what God are we really talking about here, right? And I think that's what he's interrogating here. He's like, who is the God? Because he's talking about, German, die Deutschen Christen, the German Christians, who were kind of like, during the Nazi period, who were kind of just like, of course we believe in God. And he's kind of like Christ. He's also kind of like Odin. He's kind of like, Baldur and whoever we want to be. Well, of course we believe in God. And it's like, well, you don't believe in the God of the New Testament or the Old Testament, definitely not the Old Testament, but not even the New Testament. You believe in this weird concept of God. That's not a specific God, right? That's a very general category of God. And this is probably more my interpretation and not really what Jung doesn't really go outright say this, but I think it holds that this opening up of the category of God to just God, like the divine, basically allows archetypes to just pop, to just wake up, right? Because you've opened that category up to whatever you want it to be. It's whatever you feel it is. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, look at who's here. Odin just shows up. Why is Odin here? Well, you kind of stopped being specific. And Odin, being Odin, is very opportunistic, right? And Odin's going to be like, Odin is going to do a Taylor Swift. It's me high. I'm the problem. It's me. He's going to just be there. And I think that holds. So I'd be interested in your take on that, Elliott, just a little bit.
no.
This
So
is a
so
shower
actually,
thought I had. And yes, Taylor Swift is part of it, and I like Taylor Swift. So to just get over it. Okay. For everyone who's hated.
so actually, I completely agree with you 100%, and I have a different ways of illuminating this, right? Which
Please,
is to say,
please.
if you follow from Nietzsche, right, who is just a little bit before this time, declaring, not wishing, but observing that God is dead amongst Christians, and Kierkegaard noticed this too. So
Yeah,
it's from
Kierkegaard
both
totally did too.
sides,
Yep.
right? And why did God die? Well, it's because it's because we promoted reason over God. Oh, that's a mistake, right? We
Yeah.
promoted the dead word over the living word. Well, we literally made the living word dead, right?
Yes.
By so there you go, right? And you know, to your point earlier, the really confusing thing about our version of monotheism that we have right now is the question is, who do you believe in God? And that's actually not on the new atheists for taking that framing and running with it. The new atheists correctly point out that it was these extreme monotheists who killed the category of God except for just theirs, right? And so when they ask, do you believe in God? They're saying, do you believe in the one that I'm thinking of, right? Whereas in a previous time, it would have been, who are you devoted to,
Well,
right?
and what does Christ ask of the disciples?
Follow me.
Well, no, what does he ask? Who do you say I am?
Right.
Who do you say I am? People. I know that that's not the original Greek, but that interpretation still works, right? I am.
Well,
Who do you say
and that's
I
what
am?
and the correct answer, right, is I am that I am, right?
Mhm.
Which is a very
That's
deep
who you are.
Hebrew
Yeah.
sentence, right? And
Right, yeah.
and in a further sense, right? If and this is kind of the ultimate point here, right? With I think is where you're getting to with your functional henotheism, right? Is that all of these different gods end up being the identity, right? The thing that does not change, right? The fixed point throughout time and throughout space, the identity. You are an identity, right? You have several different nearly identical states. Every time you go to sleep, you sleep in the same bed. That's an identity. Your body, everything is returned to the same state. That's symmetrically speaking, it's identical to where you were at a previous time, right? So all of these identities start to emerge out of chaos and confusion. Why? Because God died, right? And the God, the high God, the monotheistic God died, right? The henotheistic highest God died, and was replaced by all these other gods.
Oh no. The monotheistic God died, and is replaced by this chaotic henotheistic situation where everyone's competing about who. Well, of course, there's lots of gods, but my God's the best.
Well, and this is where the monotheists are kind of lying to themselves. They say there is only one God. Well, that's because your God killed all the other gods, but gods don't really die; they sleep, right? So when your God goes to sleep for a bit or dies, right? All of these other gods start waking up again and saying, "Oh, hey, it's been a while. What's up?" Right?
Again,
and
it's high. Yeah,
100%. And then they start seizing people. And we haven't dealt with these gods for centuries. Literally, we have forgotten the old ways, right? And the old gods, and now they are among us again. And we're totally unable to fight them because we in the Christian world, we've totally abandoned Yahweh, right? Even the Christians have, for the most part, right?
I think part of the problem is we've forgotten, I think, a little bit about. Well, again, I mean, Yahweh, from a Christian perspective, Yahweh was the unapproachable deity. But from a Christian perspective, it's not like you don't have a God-man hybrid who's there, right? I think it's that we, of course, Christians should care. Speaking as a Christian, of course, Christians should care about God, but I think we tend to we've fallen prey to maybe this hyper or this quasi-rationalist understanding of theistic understanding. Well, God's just kind of out there. It's like.
Right.
Yeah, but if you're a Christian,
as opposed to being right here,
God is incarnate, right? And God is incarnational, and that God, if you're a Christian, God created. If you're a Christian, you have to you really just have to. It's the only way the theology works. You have to understand the world as incarnational. Most importantly, you have to understand yourself as incarnational. God enters into existence, and it's not just random. It's for reasons, peeps. And I think that there's this. Perhaps it was an attempt to placate the rationalists. It's hard to say exactly what happened. It's probably a few different things, lots of different things at once. Regardless of that, and people can sit online and argue about the Protestants did it, the Catholics did it. It's like, who Who cares
Well,
at this point?
it,
Because
it was
all
the
you have
ending of
is
the monastic tradition in my
well,
mind. But
all you
anyway,
have is each other. It's like all you have is each other. So get over your bullshit, because the rest of the reigning god right now, the reigning gods right now hate you and hate your god. And they kind of want to eat your kids. I really do think that. And even if you're, again, minimum viable religion, even if you're a neo-pagan, I don't think all neo-pagans, they have their various understandings of God, and it's going to be very different. But I don't think all of them want to eat the kids. I think it's a certain kind of this like hyper progressive, hyper woke, really ironically, new atheist God. They kind of just, they want to consume. They're very hungry. They're thirsty.
well,
Um,
it's literally, it's so funny, right? Because all the commies talk about capitalism, right? And to a right wing audience, you can't say capitalism, right? Because fair enough. What you really do need to say is technocracy,
yeah,
technism. And really honestly, when communists are talking about the capitalism, they are talking about technism, right?
yeah,
The objectification. If you hear like, oh, you're objectifying women, well, they're literally talking about and it sounds weird to a right winger, right? Because in your mind, it's like, well, yeah, it is an object, right? It's a person object, though, right? But it's like, well, no. The point that people are making, and they're not making it well, and they're not communicating with you, and I'm here to communicate with you, on the right wing. They are literally saying that, and they wouldn't say it like this, but right wingers would say it through stuff like porn. You are treating people, right, more like objects than they are like people, right? And think about it like this,
yeah.
like,
Jackie
how
Jackie
we're
Treehorn Jackie Treehorn treats objects like women. Big Lebowski. Anyhow, keep going.
right. So the the kind of final point on that tiny point really is just to say, like, when we're talking about each other as like economic agents, right, and as like when we're thinking about each other more as minds trapped in bodies, right? One of my favorite hymns says, I would render thanks and praise, and I'd thank God basically for soul and body strangely joined, right? And we have totally abandoned the soul part of ourselves, right? And focused entirely on the body mind part. And we're not even unified there, right? Like our bodies and our mind are literally at war with each other.
Actively hate the meat space, and it's so clear. People just really don't give a shit about anything that's like in the real world, like in the physical world. They don't care.
And and of
And that's
course,
a
like
sign of,
it totally makes sense because we don't have the
yeah,
example of a Christ figure who is
yeah,
literally inhabiting both worlds. And
yeah.
by the way, it's not just Christ for because there's Prometheus, right? There's other the demigods are actually way more important. They're not
Well,
just knockoff brand gods, they're actually the gods that you can contend with, right?
and I mean, this idea of embodied deity is found in like most
For sure.
religions. Maybe
For
not
sure.
all. It's not in all, but it's in a lot. It's in many, not all, but many. I mean, you can think of like, uh, Krishna and Bhagavad Gita, right? Like you can think of a lot of different things, right? Like the embodied divine is a thing. Not universal, but it's fairly widespread. And maybe again, regardless of what you believe or you don't believe, on a functional level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's
Mm-hmm.
for a reason. Maybe that's for a reason. I'll maybe end with this as sort of a hyper stupid nerd. That's this channel. Some sort of conclusion to all the hyper goths out there. Think about World of Darkness RPG setting. The technocracy, everyone, the mages, they remove the consensus, the old consensus, and supplant it with their own.
And for the
Think about
for
it.
the
Think about
for
it.
the fantasy nerds, think about Game of Thrones, right? They removed the old gods and even the current gods for a singular feminine crazy person god, right? Think about it. Think about it, right? Like
Lots of pop culture connections here. Yeah. Yep.
it's
Yep.
it's it's screaming at us from every corner.
It's like,
Right.
yeah, it's like the stones are crying out, and I mean that in a biblical sense. Like there's something
Mm-hmm.
that's crying out, And it's not just crying out just from, you know, Christian and or Jewish sources. It's kind of crying out everywhere. It's almost like it's universal. It's almost like the world is trying to tell us something. So I don't know. It's, I
But
will say,
not the spirit world.
not the
Fuck that
spirit.
guy.
No, that's a little different.
World spirit.
Not the, yeah, not that one. Cool. Well, hey, that's probably, I know it's a little bit, it's always hard to end these huge conversations, but I feel like that's about as much of a summarization as it can give. Highly recommend the article. You know, I think you can find it pretty easily online. The translation is good, even though they don't translate those handful of German words, but I've just I've given you the glosses for them, so you can hack it. I think it's okay. You can always look it up in a German English dictionary. Jung is great. I need to read more Jung. But this is,
of course, we managed to quote unquote summarize it much longer than it takes to read it. But anyhow,
true. A sign of a good work. Sign of a good work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're gonna be entering into a slightly, it's the summertime. And I got stuff that I'd like to write. Elliott has stuff that he'd like to do. We'll still be having shows. We'll probably be having them slightly less frequently, although maybe every week. We'll see. We'll play it out. We've been pretty consistent, and consistency is good. But it's nice to do other things too. I want to keep riding on this functional henotheism thing. I'd really like to get more stuff written about it and other topics for carpeforum.com. So and Elliot has his stuff too. So but with that, so it might be slowing down a bit, but our next episode will be with a very good friend of mine, my friend Matthew. And Matthew and I will be discussing an article that we wrote and was actually published in a real deal, like academic place, journal, book, and it's all about the Ghostbusters. So whenever we're gonna have to wait a little bit here, but that's okay. We're slowing down. Ghostbusters is next, and I am incredibly excited because who doesn't love the Ghostbusters? Like, be perfectly honest, probably the best movie ever made. Citizen Kane, yeah, but Ghostbusters. Come on. Ghostbusters. It's a good movie.
Who are you gonna call? Who are you gonna call?
I mean, who are you gonna call if not them? So
there's spooks all around. Who are you gonna
there
call?
are, and we're out here we're busting the spirit of the times, we're busting the spirit of the world, right? We're busting ghosts left and right. Hegelianism, it doesn't stand a chance, right? Because
the solution to Hegelianism is Ghostbusters. Yeah.
the solution to Hegelianism is crossing the streams. That really is total protonic reversal. And with that, I'll let everyone go. Elliot, thanks for coming on again. It's always a pleasure to have you. Elliot, anything you want to bump before I let you go? I've talked about what I'm planning on doing. Anything new on your end? Doesn't have to be, but I just want to give you space.
No, I actually do have a new thing. I'm writing up a little dealio with cybernetics. I'm using logic gates to kind of explain some cybernetic stuff. I think it'll be kind of a little fun project and be an extremely concrete way to like simplify and talk through some of the bigger ideas, right? Through some extremely concrete examples that obviously don't really capture the full swath of it, but I think allow us to use a fun little toy model to kind of get the bigger picture of what we're talking about with cybernetics, to get very precise, because sometimes it can get kind of loosey-goosey, like what's even being talked about here, right? Well, I think that I'm coming up with a pretty fun, very dry, to be honest, way of doing it. So that's what I'm working on.
Well, I'm looking forward to it because I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I only understand about half of what you have to say about cybernetics. So concrete examples are good for normies like me. So we can't all be mathematicians. We just
exactly right.
All right. With that, I wish everyone a very wonderful weekend. And until next time, be thinking about egregores, functional henotheism, and Ghostbusters. All right. Peace, everyone. Take it easy. Bye.